I had assumed that because the Australian federal election finally wrapped up, and yes, that includes in Bradfield, which has now gone to the Independent officially, that I wouldn't have much to talk about in the Australian political sphere until the next big controversy or disaster or crisis came along. But much to my surprise, it seems that the Tasmanian government has chosen this moment, right after the federal election has probably wrapped up, to completely collapse. For those of you that missed it, over the last couple of days, Tasmanian politics has been crumbling in on itself, and today it reached its climax where the Premier of the state lost a vote of confidence and effectively lost his ability to properly govern Tasmania. But how did we actually get here, and what does this mean going forward? So a little bit of a catch-up. Tasmania is one of only 2 states and 1 territory that is currently governed by the coalition or some branch of it. The Northern Territory is governed by the Country Liberal Party, Queensland by the Liberal National Party, and Tasmania itself is currently governed by the Tasmanian Liberal Party. But in the Tasmanian Parliament, it does not have a majority. Now, Tasmania, uniquely among Australian states, operates its elections under a Hare-Clark system, which basically means that they have 5 divisions there and they all elect 7 members to the chamber. So while a majority government is not impossible, it's much more difficult, and normally in the Tasmanian Parliament you'll get a lot more representation from minor parties as opposed to just the traditional Labor or Liberal. The last Tasmanian election was in 2024, just last year, and there have been some defections, but at the moment the Tasmanian Parliament currently looks like this. And you will notice that the Liberal Party does not have a majority there. They are 4 seats short of 18, which would give them a functional majority. They have 14, and they rely on the support of 4 independent crossbenchers to stay in government. But what seems to have happened over the last 2 weeks, particularly after the Tasmanian government announced its budget going ahead, was that one of those crossbenchers keeping the Liberals in power lost faith in the government. Now, a little bit of backstory. There have been some controversies about people stepping down, the funding of ships in particular in Tasmania, but the main consideration when looking at the budget that the government has announced and why it was so controversial in Tasmania is that it is essentially a debt trap. Something that's important to understand is that the Tasmanian Liberals have been in power for almost 11 years now, since 2014. And since particularly 2020, the Liberals in Tasmania have been acquiring debt at a rate that a lot of people will regard as unacceptable. The situation was actually so concerning that those crossbench MPs that actually let the Liberal Party form government, one of their requests in exchange for support was that there was an independent review into the state's finances to get an understanding of why Tasmania was acquiring debt so quickly and what solutions were actually practical. And this independent review actually did take place, and it was found that the Tasmanian government has one core issue when it comes to its finances, and that is the fact that the Liberal Party, through active choice in government policy, by not raising taxes in certain areas, is actively harming the state. Speaking in economic terms, of course, but the main point is that an independent review showed that what the Tasmanian government had to do to balance the books properly was to start collecting more taxes, either through introducing land taxes, mineral right taxes, or raising payroll tax. It had to do something to bring in more money, because the cuts that the Tasmanian Liberals have been proposing, while they would do something, they are nowhere near enough to cover the rate at which the Tasmanian debt is currently growing. So when the Liberal Party had to put together a response to this independent review of the state's finances, they made the very adult decision that they respected the findings, but that they would under no circumstance at all introduce new taxes in their budget. The Liberal Party was told to its face that if it didn't start raising revenues at a new higher rate, that the financial situation for the state would be ruined for decades to come. And the Liberal Party shrugged that off and released what is widely regarded as one of the worst budgets in Tasmanian history. The Liberal Party's budget laid out a path to surplus in maybe 2028, and it said that it would be acquiring billions of dollars in debt up until that point. When the man who conducted the independent financial review into the government previously was asked what he thought of this budget, he said that by his projections, this budget, if it was put in place and the Liberals stayed in power and kept to these policies, that by 2035, within 10 years, the Tasmanian debt would double to $16 billion, and that it would be very likely that the Tasmanian government would be spending $1 million a day of taxpayer money just to service the debt that they were in. When the government's budget was presented to the Tasmanian people, it was met with an approval rating of 26%. Only 1 in every 4 people thought that it was a good idea or in any way reasonable. What the Liberal Party had presented to the Tasmanian people was a budget that would cut social services, health, education, and make the state profoundly worse, while at the same time increasing the debt exponentially because they wouldn't be willing to implement the taxes that everyone knows they have to put in place to save the state budget. This eventually became so controversial that on Tuesday, the leader of the opposition, the leader of the Labor Party in Tasmania, introduced a motion of no confidence in the Premier himself. Now, the fact that Labor introduced this bill was massive news, because there is no way they would be introducing it if they didn't know that behind closed doors, talking to crossbenchers, that they had the numbers to bring down the government. So it essentially became this moment of everyone realizing, oh my God, the Liberal Party has lost the crossbench. And what's fascinating about this confidence motion is that it was not a vote of confidence or not in the government of Tasmania. It was specifically in the Premier himself. Let me just wind back a little bit there. If you're not familiar with the parliamentary system of governance, essentially a motion of no confidence is a roll call that can be introduced by someone in the House to see whether or not the government of the day actually still has the support of a majority of members. And in this case, it looked like the Liberal Party certainly did not. But anyway, the reason it is so important to understand that this was a movement against the Premier and not the government is that, hypothetically, if it passed, and Rockcliff was defeated in this vote of confidence in the Premier himself, then the Liberal Party could continue governing. They would just have to pick a new leader of their party, and subsequently a new Premier, and then that new Premier would have to find confidence in the House. And the reason that the Labor Party kind of saw that as a win-win is because, well, Rockcliff isn't necessarily that unpopular in Tasmania. He's not a hated politician, and he's kind of viewed as the best of the pretty unimpressive Liberal front bench down there. So one of two options: either they go to an election where the Labor Party could win, or the Liberal Party has to pick a less appealing, less popular option to lead their party going forward. And look, there was a marathon session in the Tasmanian Parliament yesterday. I think they sat and debated for 9.5 hours, and unfortunately their live stream link wasn't working, so I just had to follow the updates from the ABC as they were going. But there was a lot of back and forth, and most of the talk of election was just like more vague, not concrete threats. Like, there was definitely a possibility that if Rockcliff had lost this vote, that maybe another Liberal could have taken over, but that all changed this morning. When Rockcliff showed up to Parliament this morning, he was visibly furious, and he made the point very quickly to the press gallery that if this motion passed, and he was no longer allowed to be Premier because he didn't have the confidence of the House, he would not be stepping down. Instead, he would immediately call a snap election in the hopes of securing a majority in his own right. So when Parliament met again, it was clear to everybody this was not just a vote in whether or not Rockcliff should continue to serve as Premier. This was a vote over whether or not to have an election. And mind you, the Tasmanian people had a state election last year, 15 months ago. This is a very young parliament that is not due for new elections until 2028. Add on top of that the fact that the Tasmanians went to the polls for a federal election like a month and a couple days ago. So to say that there might be some fatigue about voting amongst the Tasmanian people is not that ridiculous. So everyone in Parliament knew what the stakes were. And this next point, this isn't really political, this is more cultural for Tasmania, is that this election getting called essentially means that, quite tragically for the Tasmanian people, they will not be getting an AFL team. For my overseas viewers, the AFL, the Australian Football League, is the highest professional version of Aussie rules football. It's a very violent and a very unique sport that I highly recommend you guys go and check out. And it's been a pretty contentious issue in Tasmania lately because there is currently on the table an offer for Tasmania to get an AFL team, which it has been after for a while. But a broad overview of that deal is that the AFL will give Tasmania a team, the Tasmanian Devils, great name by the way, if the Tasmanian government pays for and builds a new stadium. And the price tag on that is about $900 million. So you can understand why it might be somewhat controversial that during a massive era of cuts where the Tasmanian government is cutting away at social services, that it's somehow finding $900 million to build a football stadium. But regardless of the merits there, the AFL has pretty much confirmed that because of this election and the uncertainty, that the AFL Tasmania new team deal is essentially dead in the water. And the AFL does not want to look at expanding down there if the political situation is so murky and so unstable. So I apologize, and my heart goes out to any Tasmanian watching this over the fact that you have probably just lost your AFL team because of this. So anyway, back to Parliament. It comes down to it. We've had hours upon hours of debate going back and forth, and it is now officially time to vote. And the final vote on the floor over whether or not the House has confidence in the Premier is 17 to 17. The Labour Party, the Greens, and a group of independents, some who previously supported the Liberals, voted against the government, and the Liberal Party and a few of their remaining supporters on the crossbench voted with them, and it was deadlocked. So it all came down to the Speaker. The Speaker, who is a member of the Tasmanian Labour Party. And with that tie-breaking vote, the House expressed that it did not have confidence in the Premier by a margin of 18 to 17. Now, the Liberal Party and Rockcliff are going to make a lot of arguments about how this is Labour forcing the Tasmanian people into another election that they don't want, but honestly, that is nonsensical. The reason that the government collapsed is simply because the Liberal Party looked at an independent review that said that the state was going to go bankrupt and be crippled by debt if they didn't change their ways. They didn't, produced the worst budget the state had ever seen, and lost the support of the crossbench. They have no one to blame but themselves. So what happens now? Well, an election isn't immediately called, even though Rockcliff is going to go to the governor, or actually the lieutenant governor, because the governor currently isn't in the state, which is a hell of a thing to miss. But he's going to go to the lieutenant governor and ask for an election. But of course, the leader of the opposition, Dean Winter, leader of the Labour Party, actually does have the right to try and form a government. But that probably isn't going to happen, because if he wanted to form a government, he would need most of the crossbench, the Greens, and all of Labour on board. And, well, the Labour Party doesn't particularly want to govern with the Greens in Tasmania, because they've done that before, and it didn't end particularly well. But that's a story for another day. So Labour is not going to work with the Greens, which pretty much confirms an election is coming for Tasmania. The earliest possible date for such an election would be July 12th, and I get the sense that the politicians on both sides are going to want to wrap this up a lot sooner rather than later, and that the election will probably be around that day. Now, I honestly have no read on how that election is going to go. I mean, it is a semi-proportional electoral system. It is very difficult to make predictions this far out. I mean, we're talking about a month, but still quite far out. We haven't seen the campaign yet, but I do know that as somebody who loves elections and loves Australian politics, this next month of campaigning is going to be unbelievable.